There are times in life when we feel alone, abandoned, as though the whole world has turned its back on us. We question why we are stuck in isolation, in a season of silence, with no clear direction ahead. There may be moments when it feels like everything around us is falling apart, as though we're being cut off from the world, from those we love, and even from the very dreams we once believed would come to fruition. It is in these moments that we are often tempted to believe the lie that this season of isolation is the end of our story. But what if this season, this time of feeling abandoned, this silence, is not a sign that God has forgotten us, but rather that He is preparing us for something far greater than we could ever imagine? It is important to understand that isolation is not always a sign of punishment. It is not always a result of something we have done wrong or a consequence of our mistakes. More often than not, isolation is a divine appointment. It is a time when God withdraws us from the noise, distractions, and false comforts of the world to speak to us, to refine us, to prepare us for the blessings He has in store. The truth is, God often does His greatest work in the seasons of isolation. It is during these times that He shapes us, molds us, and strengthens us in ways that cannot happen in the noise and comfort of crowded, busy lives. Think about the great men and women of faith throughout Scripture. Moses, for instance, spent 40 years in the wilderness before God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. In that wilderness, Moses was alone. He was a man on the run, living in a place far from home, with no immediate purpose in sight. But God was not distant from Moses in his isolation. No, He was working in Moses' heart, preparing him for the greatest mission of his life. Moses was not abandoned. He was being prepared. Consider the life of David. Before he was crowned king of Israel, David spent many years in isolation, hiding in caves, running from King Saul, who sought to kill him. At times, David must have felt abandoned. He was the anointed king, yet he lived as a fugitive. But during this time, God was shaping David into the leader He had called him to be. It was in those dark, lonely days that David learned to trust in God's provision, protection, and timing. It was during these times of isolation that David wrote many of the Psalms that continue to inspire and uplift believers today. His isolation was not a punishment. It was the place where God was molding him into the man after His own heart. Then there is the story of Jesus, who, after being baptized, was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where He was tempted by the devil for 40 days. The Son of God Himself was not exempt from seasons of isolation. In fact, His time of solitude in the wilderness was one of the most significant moments in His life. It was in that isolation that He fasted, prayed, and overcame the temptations of the enemy. Jesus' time in the wilderness was a preparation for the ministry that was to come. It was a time for Him to draw closer to His Father, to be strengthened spiritually, and to set the example for all who would follow Him. Jesus was not abandoned in His isolation. He was being equipped for the work He was called to do. You see, isolation does not always mean that God is distant or that we are abandoned. It may mean that God is setting us apart for a purpose that we cannot yet understand. He is preparing us for the next season of our lives, a season where His blessings will flow into our lives in ways we could never imagine. In the silence of isolation, God speaks. In the solitude of our hearts, He shapes. In the wilderness of life, he strengthens. We may not always see it in the moment, but God is at work. Sometimes we long for the blessings of God and we cry out for them, but we are not yet ready to receive them. We're like a young child who asks for a gift but is not yet mature enough to handle it. God in his wisdom knows that we need to be prepared. He knows that blessings without preparation can lead to destruction. So he leads us into seasons of isolation where he works in us and on us, refining our character, building our faith, and teaching us to trust him fully. He is getting us ready for the blessings that are on the horizon. It is during times of isolation that we learn to lean on God in a deeper way. When everything else is stripped away, we are left with nothing but God himself. And it is in those moments that we discover the fullness of his presence. We come to realize that he is enough. He is our refuge and strength, our ever-present help in times of trouble. We may not understand why we are in this season, but we can trust that he is working all things for our good. God uses the seasons of isolation to expose areas in our lives that need healing, growth, and transformation. We all have wounds, scars from the past, areas of our hearts that need to be healed. Sometimes it takes isolation for us to confront those things. Sometimes it takes being alone with God to allow him to heal what has been broken. It is in the silence of isolation that we can hear the still, small voice of God calling us to a deeper level of healing and wholeness. We also find that in isolation, we are given the opportunity to grow in our dependence on God. When we are surrounded by people, by activity, by distractions, it is easy to rely on our own strength. But in isolation, we have no choice but to lean on God. It is in our weakness that his strength is made perfect. It is in our loneliness that his presence becomes most real. And it is in our isolation that we discover the depth of God's love for us, his faithfulness, and his ability to meet our every need. There are many who may be walking through seasons of isolation right now. You may feel alone, abandoned, and forgotten. But I urge you to look at your situation from a different perspective. What if this season is not about what you have lost, but about what God is preparing to give you? What if this silence is not a sign of God's absence, but a sign of his presence? What if the isolation you are experiencing is not a sign of rejection, but a sign that God is about to bless you in ways that you cannot yet see? God is never idle. He is never distant. He is always working, even when we cannot see it. He is at work in the silence. He is at work in the wilderness. He is at work in the seasons of isolation. And just as he prepared Moses, David, and even Jesus in their times of solitude, he is preparing you. He is getting you ready for a season of blessings that will exceed your expectations. So, my friend, do not despair in your season of isolation. Do not lose heart when you feel alone. Instead, trust that God is working. Trust that he is refining you, shaping you, and preparing you for the next great chapter of your life. Your season of isolation may very well be a sign that God is about to bless you in a way that you have never known before. In the quiet and the stillness, God is doing something in you. He is preparing you to receive his blessings. And when the time is right, he will bring you out of this season stronger, wiser, and ready to walk into the fullness of the life he has planned for you. So take heart, because God is not finished with you yet. He is preparing you for something great. Trust in him. For he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. I'm sure that for many, when they find themselves alone, they may feel as though God has somehow turned his back on them. They wonder why it is that others seem to be flourishing while they themselves are trapped in a season of solitude and silence. The emotional and spiritual pain of isolation can sometimes feel unbearable. You feel forgotten, as if your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling, unheard and unanswered. But I want you to understand something today. This season is not a time of abandonment. It is a time of preparation. It is a time. There are seasons in life where God calls us to step away from the noise, to step away from the constant distractions, to step away from everything that would keep us from hearing his voice clearly. When we are too wrapped up in the busyness of life, too distracted by the things of this world, it becomes difficult to hear what God is trying to tell us. He desires to speak to our hearts, to draw us closer to himself. But there are times when we need to be separated from the world so that we can truly hear him. In those moments of silence when the world seems to be moving on without us, when we feel as if everyone else is busy with their own lives and we are left behind, God is working. He is working in us, in our hearts, and in our minds. He is preparing us for something greater than we could have ever imagined. The purpose of isolation is not to punish us, but to refine us. It is a season of training, a time when we are equipped with the spiritual tools, the wisdom, and the strength needed for the next step in our journey. When we are in isolation, God does not want us to feel discouraged. Instead, he wants us to trust him in a deeper way, to rely on him more fully, to rest in his presence more completely. You see, God does not abandon us in our seasons of isolation. He draws near. He comes close to those who are brokenhearted and crushed in spirit. He whispers in the silence, teaching us to surrender, to trust, and to obey. It is during these times when we are most vulnerable, when we are most alone, that God's love can break through the hardest of hearts. It is in the silence that we can hear his voice speaking the loudest. Look at the life of Joseph. He was sold into slavery by his own brothers, cast aside, and left to fend for himself in a foreign land. He was isolated from his family, from everything he had ever known. He could have easily turned bitter, angry at God for allowing him to go through such suffering. But God used that time of isolation to shape Joseph into the man he needed to be in order to fulfill his destiny. In the pit, in slavery, and in prison, Joseph remained faithful. He chose to trust God in the midst of his pain, and God elevated him to a position of authority where he was able to save countless lives, including those of his very brothers who had betrayed him. Joseph's season of isolation was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would bless many. God used isolation to prepare Joseph for greatness. And just like Joseph, God is using this season of isolation in your life to prepare you for the blessings that are coming. It may not make sense now. It may be hard to understand why God is allowing you to walk through this time of silence, but trust me when I tell you that he is not wasting it. He is not wasting a single moment. He is at work even when you cannot see it. He is moving behind the scenes, orchestrating everything for your good. Perhaps you feel like you are in a season of waiting. You have prayed for something, and it seems as though the answer is always just out of reach. The promises that God has made to you seem so far away, but waiting is a part of the process. The Bible tells us that those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. Isaiah 40:30-31. Waiting is not passive. It is active. It is a time when God strengthens our faith, when he refines our character, when he teaches us to trust in his timing. Waiting is not easy, but it is necessary. It teaches us that God's ways are higher than our ways, that his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Isaiah 55, verse 9. His timing is perfect, and when the time is right, he will answer our prayers. But even in the waiting, we must remember that God is at work. He is preparing us for the blessings that are to come. Think about how a seed must be buried in the ground before it can sprout and grow into a tree. It must first die to itself, be buried in darkness before it can experience new life. And so it is with us. Our seasons of isolation, of waiting, are like that seed in the ground. They may seem dark and uncomfortable, but they are preparing us for new growth. God is working beneath the surface where we cannot see to bring about his perfect plan for our lives. You might also be wondering, why is God allowing me to experience such pain in this season? The truth is, pain is often part of the process. God uses our pain to purify us, to refine us, to make us more like Christ. It is through the trials that we are strengthened, that our faith is tested and proven. The Apostle Paul reminds us that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. Romans 5:3 and 4. Pain is never wasted in God's hands. It is through the fire that we are purified, like gold refined in the flames. We also need to remember that in the midst of our isolation, God is preparing us to be a blessing to others. You see, the blessings we receive from God are not just for us. They are meant to be shared with others. God is not only preparing us for his blessings, but he is preparing us to be a blessing to those around us. In the same way that Jesus was alone in the wilderness, preparing for the ministry ahead, we are being prepared for the opportunities to serve, to love, and to bless those who are in need. Our isolation is not just for our own good, it is for the good of others as well. In our season of isolation, God is teaching us compassion. He is teaching us how to love others more deeply because we understand their pain. He is teaching us how to reach out to the brokenhearted because we have been brokenhearted. He is teaching us how to minister to others because we have been ministered to by his grace. The blessings we receive from God are meant to overflow into the lives of those around us. And the more we allow God to work in us during our season of isolation, the more we are able to pour out his love, his peace, and his hope to a world that desperately needs it. Perhaps you are still feeling uncertain about this season of isolation. Perhaps you are questioning why God has allowed you to go through this time. It may feel as though your prayers are unanswered and your hopes are dashed. But I want to encourage you today to trust in the process. Trust that God is using this time to prepare you for something greater. Trust that he has not forgotten you. He has not abandoned you. He is working in your life even when you cannot see it. He is preparing you for blessings that you cannot yet comprehend. As you walk through this season, know that you are not alone. God is with you. He is guiding you, shaping you, and refining you. He is using this time to prepare you for the next chapter of your life. So embrace this season of isolation, knowing that it is not the end, it is the beginning of something beautiful. God is about to bless you in ways that you could never imagine. Your isolation is not a sign of rejection. It is a sign that God is at work. He is preparing you for something greater. Keep trusting. Keep waiting. Keep believing. God is not finished with you yet. I understand that it may feel difficult in those quiet moments, especially when life is so loud and you are left with what seems like nothing but silence. But these seasons are part of God's design, and the beauty of the silence is that it often leads to the revelation of God's deepest truths. What we consider isolation, a time of loneliness, is in reality a sacred space where God can reveal himself to us in ways that we are not able to perceive when surrounded by the noise of life. The great truth is that we never know the full extent of God's plan until it unfolds. He is always at work, even in seasons when we cannot see it. Think of the times in your life when you felt abandoned or alone. Maybe you were in a difficult season of your life, and all you could do was cry out to God, but you felt as though no one was listening. It is easy to believe in those moments that God has turned his back, but nothing could be further from the truth. God has not turned his back. He is working. He is preparing. Throughout the Bible, there are countless stories of people who experienced isolation, yet in those very seasons, they were being prepared for greater blessings. Consider the story of Job, who lost everything, his wealth, his health, and his family. He sat in the ashes in a season of deep pain and loss, and he questioned why this was happening to him. But through that time of isolation, through that time of suffering, God revealed himself to Job in a way that never would have happened had Job not gone through that trial. Job's suffering led to a deeper understanding of who God is, a more profound relationship with him, and a greater appreciation for his sovereignty. There is something about isolation that removes the distractions and forces us to focus solely on our relationship with God. It is when we are at our lowest, when we have nothing left to hold on to, that we often discover the true depth of God's love for us. When we are stripped of everything, we are able to see clearly that God is the only one who remains. He is our constant, our refuge, our strength. In these moments of weakness, he shows us his strength. And it is in the depths of isolation that we truly discover the height and depth of his love for us. Isolation is also a time for personal growth. It is in these seasons that we are shaped and refined. When we are left alone, we are forced to face ourselves, to confront the areas of our hearts that we have ignored, to acknowledge the things that need to change. It is during this time that we begin to see our weaknesses, our shortcomings, and the places in our lives where we need to grow. God uses these moments to work in us, to help us become more like Christ, to purify us so that we can be vessels for his glory. It is through isolation that God strengthens our faith. There is a truth that is often revealed in our solitude. We can trust God no matter what. When everything is falling apart, when we feel like we are on the edge of despair, it is in those moments that we realize that our faith in God is the only thing that can carry us through. In the wilderness of isolation, our faith is tested and made strong. We come to a place where we realize that no matter the circumstances, God is faithful. We learn that his love never fails, that his promises are true, and that he is always with us, even when we cannot see it. Another gift of isolation is that it is often in these moments that we learn to pray more earnestly. When we are surrounded by the distractions of life, our prayers can become shallow or routine. But when we find ourselves alone, when we have no one else to turn to, our prayers become more genuine, more heartfelt. In these seasons, we learn to pour out our hearts to God, to cry out to him with honesty and vulnerability. It is in these moments that we build a deeper intimacy with God, a deeper relationship with him. And it is in these seasons of prayer that God often reveals things to us, things about ourselves, things about His will for our lives that we would not have learned otherwise. In the wilderness, we are also reminded of the importance of community. While isolation may seem like it is about being alone, it often teaches us the value of the community we have when we are not isolated. We begin to see the beauty of relationships with others, and we realize that we are not meant to walk this journey alone. While we may go through seasons of solitude for growth and preparation, we are not designed to remain there forever. We are called to live in community, to support one another, to encourage one another, and to walk through life together. Isolation teaches us the value of companionship, the power of shared experiences, and the importance of being there for one another in times of need. But it is important to remember that the process of isolation is not forever. It may feel like it is, especially when you are deep in the midst of it, but nothing in life lasts forever, not even seasons of isolation. Just as the seasons change, so do the seasons of our lives. You may feel that your season of isolation is unending, but rest assured that it has a purpose. And when that purpose is fulfilled, God will move you into the next season of life. That next season may be one of growth, of blessings, of answered prayers, but it will only come after you have learned the lessons of the isolation. God knows the right timing. He knows what you need, and He knows when you are ready to move forward. In many ways, isolation is a time of preparation. It is like a training ground where God is refining you for the plans He has for your future. And as hard as it may be to endure, it is also a season where great transformation takes place. God is refining you, purifying you, and shaping you into the person He created you to be. The pain you feel in isolation is not wasted. It is part of the process, part of the journey, part of what God is doing in your life. As you go through this season, remember that God is with you. He is by your side, strengthening you, comforting you, and guiding you through every moment of it. He has not left you. He is preparing you for something greater than you can even imagine. You may not be able to see it now, but this season will pass. And when it does, you will look back and see how God used that time to shape you, to draw you closer to Himself, and to prepare you for what is to come. It may be difficult now, but it is not forever. And when God brings you out of this season, He will bring you out stronger, more equipped, and more prepared for the next season of blessings He has for you. You will see the beauty in the silence, the growth that comes from the solitude, and the way God has used this time to draw you closer to Him. You may wonder, how long will this season last? It's a question many of us ask during times of struggle. But the truth is that we do not always know the answer. We do not always understand why things happen the way they do. But what we do know is that God is faithful and He will never leave us. He is working in us and on us, preparing us for a future full of hope, full of His love, and full of blessings. Trust in His timing. Trust that He is leading you even when you cannot see the path ahead. Trust that He is working even when it feels like nothing is happening. And most of all, trust that this season of isolation is not the end. It is the beginning of something new, something better, something that will bring glory to God and joy to your heart. God is about to do something in you and through you that will make this season of isolation worth it. Keep your eyes on Him. Keep your heart open to His work and trust that He is preparing you for blessings beyond your wildest dreams. As you continue to walk through this season of isolation, remember that you are not forgotten by God. It may feel like you are, especially when everything around you seems to be moving ahead while you are stuck in place, but he sees you. God knows your struggles, your heartaches, your pain, and he has not left you to wander alone in the wilderness. He is walking with you, even in the silence. He is close to the brokenhearted, and he is near to those who are in distress. Sometimes we don't understand the way God works, especially when we are going through a season of waiting and loneliness. But the truth is, he is never idle. While we might not be able to see his hand at work, he is moving in ways that we cannot perceive. He is preparing you for something greater, something that will make all this waiting worth it. The struggles and challenges that seem so difficult now are forming you into someone who will be able to handle the blessings and responsibilities that are coming your way. Isolation can be an uncomfortable place to be. It's a place where you confront your deepest fears, insecurities, and weaknesses. But it's also the place where you come to rely on God in ways you never thought possible. It's in those moments of loneliness that God's voice becomes clearer, his presence more real. When everything else is stripped away, what remains is your relationship with him. And that relationship is the most important thing you can have. God desires to walk with you in every season, not just the seasons of joy and celebration, but also in the seasons of pain, waiting, and growth. The longer we spend in isolation, the more we tend to question God's goodness, wondering why he allows us to endure such loneliness. But God's love for you is constant, unwavering, and unchanging. It is during these times that he is inviting you to experience a deeper intimacy with him, one that transcends circumstance and is rooted in his unshakable faithfulness. You may feel like you're in a dark tunnel, but God is the light at the end, guiding you through it. This time is not wasted. The lessons you are learning now, the things God is teaching you in this season, are things that will carry you forward into the next chapter of your life. When you come out of this season, you will be stronger, wiser, and more ready for the new blessings that God has for you. The isolation will no longer feel like a curse, but a beautiful and necessary part of the process that brought you closer to God. Even when it feels like you are standing still, remember that God is at work. His plans are unfolding, and he is preparing you for the future he has already laid out for you. In conclusion, your season of isolation is not a sign of rejection, but rather a divine opportunity for growth, preparation, and intimacy with God. Though it may feel lonely and difficult, trust that God is using this time to refine you, strengthen your faith, and equip you for the blessings that lie ahead. Just as the seed must be buried in the soil before it can grow, so too must we experience moments of solitude to blossom into the person God has called us to be. In the silence and stillness, he is near, guiding you, teaching you, and preparing you for a future filled with hope and purpose. As you navigate this season, hold fast to the truth that God's plans are always for your good, and that in his perfect timing, he will bring you into the next chapter of your life. Keep your eyes on him and trust that the blessings he has in store for you are worth the wait.